All right. Welcome, everybody. I know we've got some folks still logging on. Welcome back for our third panel of the day. I hope everybody enjoyed their virtual lunches. I'm very sad myself not to be able to meet everybody in person and chat in person over snacks in the auditorium, as is typical of these events, but nonetheless, am thrilled for our panel today on abolishing ICE and beyond. I know we've still got a few folks trickling in, so I'm going to give everybody a minute to get back from lunch before launching in. And before I give out the coveted CLE code words, so I'll just give that a moment. So for those of you who are just joining us here at the symposium today, if you have any questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we will answer them at the end during the Q&A portion. Now we've got a few more folks logging on now, so I will proceed with the CLE password. So for those of you who are just logging on for this panel, if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that the CLE codes will be announced 3 times during the event, sort of like word of the day on Sesame Street, if we have any avid Sesame Street fans. Write down these codes and be sure to enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and the link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email for the event. But if you didn't receive the email, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These codes will tell us how long you've attended the symposium for. So you should see now in the chat, we have the event evaluation form where you will input your CLE code words. The first of 3 of which I'm going to announce now. So for those who need them, please pay attention. The first code word of the panel is abolition. That's ABOLITION, abolition. All right, so with that, we'll turn to our panel. Today, we're going to be discussing the intersection of abolition and immigration. In recent years, the urgent need for dramatic action in order to achieve anything resembling immigration justice in this country became apparent to many as the past administration's unique depravities generated an endless flood of wrenching headlines. But for many others in the immigrants' rights movement, however, the previous administration's cruelty was a change in degree, but not in kind. As you'll hear from our panel today, the suffering that we've seen inflicted on immigrants through state violence and surveillance in recent years is the result of an immigration system designed from first principles of racial control and economic exploitation. As a result, many lawyers and activists have insisted that the only way to immigration justice is through abolition. But what does that mean exactly? And this, in essence, is the question that I hope we can begin to answer during our conversation today. So with that, let me introduce our stellar panel, who I am just thrilled to speak with on this. So we have joining us Professor Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez, a professor of law at the University of Denver, who writes and teaches about the intersection of criminal and immigration law. He has published 2 books, Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants, and Crimmigration Law, which is assigned reading for the Crimmigration seminar here at Penn Law. His scholarly articles about the right to counsel for migrants in the criminal justice system, immigration imprisonment, and race-based immigration policing have appeared in the California Law Review, UCLA Law Review, BYU Law Review, Maryland Law Review, and Georgetown Immigration Law Review, among others. He also publishes the blog crimmigration.com, a link to which we will be putting into the chat. And I highly recommend all of our attendees interested in this subject check out if they haven't already. Cesar was born and raised in McAllen, Texas, and is of counsel to Garcia and Garcia attorneys at law. Tanya Matos is the Northeast Policy and Monitoring Manager for the organization Freedom for Immigrants. She focuses on supporting community-based visitation and human rights monitoring programs in detention centers and supports policy and advocacy efforts at the federal and state level throughout New York, New Jersey, and the New England region. Tanya is also co-founder of Queens Neighborhoods United, a grassroots anti-gentrification collective that fights against undemocratic use of land, police abuse, and ICE in the immigrant welcoming borough of Queens, New York. She is a proud immigrant, born in La Paz, Bolivia, and raised in Jackson Heights, Queens. Finally, Natasha Elena Ulman is a writer and activist from Sonora, Mexico, currently based in New York City. She is the author of the book Abolish ICE, which envisions an abolitionist future for the immigrant rights movement. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Teen Vogue, Rewire News, and Bitch Media. Nati also edited and translated President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's book, A New Hope for Mexico. So today I'd like to begin our conversation, panelists, by doing some of the reimagining that we've heard in each of the previous panels, by asking, what does your ideal vision of an abolitionist future look like for immigrant communities in the United States? And whoever would like to answer first, feel free to hop in.
I can go. For me, it looks like a lot of things. It looks like a world where we take seriously the notion that everyone deserves safety and think critically about what that means, about how our existing security mechanisms, ICE, the courts, police, do not deliver on that safety, but instead endanger our communities. And ask, what keeps us safe? When people in need of shelter receive it, when those who are hungry are fed, when we come together as a society and recognize that meeting each other's needs is really foundational to a good life. This future looks like asserting that no human being is illegal, that migration is not a crime, it's as enduring as human history. And it means drawing a line in the sand and saying we will not collaborate with an immoral agency. What would it look like if the US acknowledged its role in inciting violence and hunger across the globe for generations? If it committed to righting these historical wrongs by way of reparations and cancellation of foreign debts? If we just were to cast aside these sort of assessments about what is realistic and achievable and instead, be resolute in our refusal to accept an immoral state of affairs. That's the broad strokes for me.
Thank you, Nati.
That's a great explanation. Thank you so much for speaking first. My idea of abolition of ICE means almost similar to what Natasha said. Something that I've heard and I really like the idea of thinking about this a little bit more is permanent protection for people. And just having it be permanent. I think that's what people just who are trying to survive right now feel like that is a need in their lives, but also a right to live well, right? Not to live like Jeff Bezos or any multi-billionaire, but just to live well, and having the right to happiness. I think that is a human right to be happy. In my idea. So in terms of abolition, this ICE system and DHS and many other systems that, sort of encompass and support the system of ICE and the terrorizing of immigrants and other community members and their families has to disappear. I don't know what kind of world we live in where this is acceptable, just the terrorizing of human beings. We know that this is the history of the United States and of many parts of the world, but there's something that I think is really a great opportunity that I think has been shifting a lot more in the United States, and that's the call for abolition of not only just ICE, but of police, of incarceration, of many other things, of landowners, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that ICE is one factor in the many other movements that are calling for the abolition of abuse, really, and power. Yeah, that's my simple explanation for abolition.
Yeah, and I would echo the comments by Natasha and Tanya. I think that they're suggesting that we have to approach abolition in the immigration context from a broader perspective in terms of a reimagination of the relationship between individual members of our communities and the state. The state, of course, wields an immense coercive apparatus, one that it has at its disposal to exercise in a discretion, in many ways, a discretionary manner, and one that we see time and time again wielded in particular against people who are deemed to be undesirable. And the definition of what that means has changed over time, but the relationship between the state and individuals has not. And I think it begins with a sense of a policy that begins in individual and collective self-reflection, and this notion that none of us as individuals and certainly not us as a community, as a political community, has ever reached our aspirations. We are all imperfect, fallible people. Most of us go about our daily lives in a rather ordinary fashion, and for most of us, that's good enough, right? Because the moments of sweetness, the special moments, are private moments. They're moments that happen in our own lives, in the lives of our families, and the lives of that we share with a small group of people. But within those circles, there are moments of failure. There are moments in which we all do things that we ought not to do. And certainly as a collective, as a political community, that has been our history, that's our present, and that will almost certainly be our future. And yet when it comes to immigration, and the perspective that the law takes and law enforcement takes toward people who are not citizens of the United States, we do expect a higher level of performance, and it's one that is ultimately, I think, the basis upon which so many of the policies that result in families being separated and people being locked up and people dying turn on.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those wonderful answers and helping us set our sights towards the broader future that we're working towards here. All of you alluded to the abolition of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is a policy goal that gained wider spread popularity, I should say, during this most previous administration. And I'm interested in hearing from each of you, but perhaps we could start with Nati as the author of Abolish ICE. What abolishing ICE, how we would go about doing it, and not necessarily what we would put in its place, but instead, I suppose, what we expect to come after. So we could start with Nati, but yeah.
So, some will argue that abolition is an impossible goal, that reform is the only means of change in our lifetime. But I would really argue that we have to dream bigger. Immigration reform has meant really minor concessions to some at a staggering cost for the many. It's meant upholding binaries of good and bad immigrants, where goodness is always conditional, it's racialized, and it's easily revoked. It means being held to a standard of scrutiny that no US citizen could or would bear. Immigration reform has won us filthy detention centers and agents that operates in the shadows. We can and we must do better. And it's been said before, but the vast likelihood is that you yourself are older than ICE, though of course our immigration policy has been violent and xenophobic long before. But it's really important to assess the context through which ICE arose. It was founded in the aftermath of 9/11, fundamentally rooted in this bipartisan idea that immigrants are naturally more predisposed to violence and that they're a national security threat. And I think that we can't meaningfully talk about ICE and Border Patrol abolition without a history of what came before. To ask yourself, in the face of gratuitous ICE and Border Patrol cruelty, these agencies that are so quick to use sexual violence as a tool and lock away children, the right wing likes to ask, what would make a parent undergo that journey? Don't cross the border, people die. If you care about your kids, don't do it. So the question remains, right? Why would someone go? Well, only if not going is staggeringly worse, right? And when you look at it, when you ask why is it worse, the answer is by and large a really vicious and murderous US foreign policy. You know, a lot of conversations around immigration start from this framework of America is so kind to let in immigrants, how many should we ever so generously allow in? And I just think that's starting from the completely wrong position, because if we don't start from a history of US imperialism, we miss half the story. For decades, the US has stoked instability across Central America. In 1954, US overthrew democratically elected Guatemalan president Caco Arbenz. He was a populist. He was calling for land redistribution to the country's poorest, which angered a rich US corporation, the United Fruit Company. And so the US helped overthrow the government for wanting to help its poorest and threatening corporate profits. And that led to a civil war that killed over 200,000. Even calling it a civil war implies some sort of balanced aggression. This was really a slaughter. We saw some 50,000 civilians disappeared, and 93% of the documented human rights violations attributed to police and military forces backed by the US. In El Salvador, the US funded and trained the military in its crackdown against leftists and poor rural peasants. Anyone, indigenous peoples were massacred wholesale as suspected leftists just because of how they looked. The government's campaign was ruthless and again backed by US forces. In the most visible incident, El Mozote, the Salvadoran army slaughtered more than 900 civilians over the course of 3 days. Bodies were piled at a local church, and soldiers bragged of abusing children. So without this context, right, the US looks like a kind savior opening its doors to the dispossessed. There's this whole mythology about America letting in the weary, but armed with this history, and there's so much more of it. We can ask not like, how kind is America for letting people in, but what do we owe the victims of our brutal repression, right? How do we make up for mothers who lost children, entire countries destabilized, futures robbed? Through that context, I think freedom of movement really becomes the bare minimum, right? In terms of how to go about it, I know Tanya has a lot of really important things to say, but I'll just pop in super briefly to name a few key strategies. Targeting companies and organizations that do business with ICE, like Amazon, Wayfair, Microsoft, and others, and applying public pressure campaigns that are organized from the bottom up. To take a sort of tangential example, in June of 2018, Google employees just put forth a really sustained employee backlash. They vowed until Google vowed not to extend its contract with the Department of Defense. So, thousands of Google employees wrote an open letter, raised a big stink about it. And similarly, Movimiento Cosecha's No Business with ICE campaign has sort of built off this energy by calling on supporters to boycott companies and institutions that are collaborating with ICE. They declare really unapologetically, which I think is so important, that anyone profiting off of the agency is complicit in family separation and in ICE terror. And a lot of students have done a lot of brave organizing in this vein. Students at Northeastern and Johns Hopkins called on their institutions to cease their contracts with ICE, and which I think raises an important note that even an interruption of smaller, more mundane contracts, like they had focused on that their universities were leasing parking spots to ICE, stuff like that in the aggregate can really be hugely disruptive. And of course, organizing around defunding. ICE spends billions of dollars each year to terrorize our communities to the tune of, it was 7.5 billion in fiscal year 2018. And every year, of course, they ask for more and more. That same year, they lobbied for an additional 1 billion to meet their deportation targets. And this was just weeks after Hurricane Florence. DHS had rerouted $10 million from FEMA to ICE. So I think that's the really essential thing to keep in mind, that this money doesn't come out of nowhere. It's diverted from programs that meet basic human needs. I pulled the numbers, and with just 1 year of ICE's budget, we could more than double funding to combat the opioid epidemic, or fix Flint's water 136 times over, or fund the National Endowment for the Arts for another 49 years, right? So like, a budget is a moral document. These decisions, even though they're sort of invisible to us on a day-to-day, have implications for all of us. So I think being loud in our demands to defund ICE is one of the most essential things we can all be doing. Sorry for the rant.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Nati, and Cesar and Tanya. If you have anything to add, please feel free to.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of how to go about abolishing ICE, first of all, the way that I want to make clear that the way DHS has was created and has sort of entrenched other agencies into their cesspool of, other agencies that have been made very critical for the function of the U.S. government. So I think that's why there's a call to dismantle DHS. But in terms of Border Patrol, ICE, even immigration courts, all that, it's almost like you need to, the whole thing is pretty corrupt, and it's based off of white supremacy. And so that's why the call is to abolish ICE, and how to go about that. First of all, I think that there are detention centers don't need to exist. First of all, prisons don't need to exist to hold folks. But in particular for detention centers, there are ways that people have been able to wait in their homes for their immigration cases to be heard by judges. So there are other, I don't want to call it alternatives, but there's a decarceration wave that's happening right now in the United States of ways that we can have no need for detention, but have people just wait at home if they've been picked up, if they've been arrested, etc. So that's on one front. I think we're just at the beginning of those conversations about, technically speaking, how to go about creating a system where people are able to live here free of being persecuted. So in terms of technicality, I think we just have to look back at how it was created and how it's now grown into this monster that it's grown into. I know a lot of people will fight tooth and nail to keep ICE because now it provides jobs for counties that are very much needed. So that's actually the fight that we're in right now, in particular in New Jersey and in Hudson County. The Hudson County folks there are saying, we need the money, right, from bodies that we detained here. But when residents hear about that, they say, no, we don't. Like, we're willing to pay more taxes to supplement whatever it takes to free people. So this whole idea of abolishing ICE, I do feel, has gone mainstream, where people on the street are saying, no, I don't want my money I don't want to reap any benefits based off of people being incarcerated for their immigration status right now in Hudson County in particular, which is a very heavily immigrant community. So that's the fight that we're in right now in New York and Orange County, and all the counties in many of the counties in New Jersey, where there's still that moral connection of, hey, how can we close these facilities, move towards abolishing ICE, move towards eliminating a lot of the 1996 laws and all the persecuting laws that exist for immigrants right now. But technically, I think we're just at the beginning of those conversations. But I'm pretty sure, that there are some very smart people that can figure out, technically speaking, how can we eliminate ICE one by one, and just deal with the repercussions of how do we provide that that relief for workers, right? Because a lot of the people that work in these jails and facilities are people from the community, and we've tried to find out exactly who they are. Who are these officers that are working there? Are they immigrants themselves? We're trying to talk to them as well, and yeah, for them it's about a paycheck. And it's about getting benefits, where in society right now, there are not many jobs that give pensions. There are not many jobs that give any of those benefits to working class folks, right? So we have to think of ways how to, one, eliminate the process, but also deal with real repercussions that unions may come against us, and really fight to keep these facilities open. So.
Hey, if I could add to that, so one of the things that Nati said early on was we have to dream bigger, and I think I'm probably paraphrasing, but something along those lines. And I'd say that there are some people. I think we have to keep in mind that there are people who are dreaming bigger. When Stephen Miller was working for a United States senator named Jeff Sessions, he was effectively just a congressional sideshow. Well, Stephen Miller obviously was never wary of inflicting enormous amounts of misery on human lives, and he persevered. He continued until his dreams, my nightmares, but his dreams turned into reality. Reality in the form of law, in the form of policy, in the form of law enforcement practices. And so there are people who are dreaming bigger, and I think one of the things that the conversations about abolition generally, but certainly about abolishing ICE and abolishing immigration law enforcement, various sectors of immigration law enforcement above and beyond simply ICE, frequently get caught up on is the search for perfection. There's this idea that there has to be a perfect plan that addresses every possible chain in what is an enormous, every possible link in what is an enormous chain of policies and laws and budgets that have been enacted over the years to create this massive immigration law enforcement regime with which we're also so familiar with, I imagine. But the thing is, when Congress was going around about debating the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, they didn't stop because of a lack of perfection. They didn't stop because they could not answer every question. They did not stop because they could not foresee every single possibility. And they certainly did not stop because there might be the possibility that they would fail to accomplish some goal that they embraced, right? And I think those of us who embrace a different vision of justice, those of us who embrace a different vision of the value of human life, ought not to be stopped by those very same concerns. Abolishing any single agency, especially one as enormous as ICE, is complicated. But abolishing an entire system of law enforcement practices and substantive legal requirements on top of that is just reflected in this one agency, ICE, is even more complicated. And it will certainly be imprecise. It will certainly be imperfect. There will certainly be flaws. But if we're not willing to embrace this normative goal of a future that looks radically different from the present, then we're certainly never going to get there, right? And so I want to reiterate that suggestion and that we have to dream bigger. We do. Not only because that's the way to put ourselves on the road to this different path, but because other people are dreaming bigger, right? And they are turning their dreams into laws and into policies, and they're doing so through the offices of elected representatives. They're doing that through appointments to courts. They're certainly doing that through the political process, and that's happening with very real consequences on a daily basis in communities across the country and elsewhere.
Thank you, everyone, for those fantastic answers. Tanya, I want to talk to you about, or I would love for you to talk to us about your work in Hudson County and elsewhere, closing individual centers. But before we get to that, I think I would like to stick with you, Cesar. And when in Tanya's answer, when she was talking about dreaming bigger and what it looks like technically, something she referenced was, looking back to how ICE was created. And we've already sort of referred to the post 9/11 recent history, but I would love for you to share with us a little bit about the more distant history, and in particular, how close we came to abolishing immigration detention as a system during the Eisenhower administration. So if you could tell us a little bit about what you think that moment in history does or doesn't teach us about dreaming bigger and this just future that we're reaching for, that would be great.
Yeah, so starting in the late 19th century, when first the Page Act and then the Chinese Exclusion Act were enacted by Congress, they started to develop for the first time, really, a large body of federal immigration law. And with that came the necessity to figure out who's excluded, who's not excluded, who's a Chinese laborer, who's not a Chinese laborer, right? And the sorting process then necessitated a place in which the sorting happened. And so that's how we started to develop immigration imprisonment early on in the late 19th century. We fast forward though to the middle of the 20th century, and this is still happening. It's happening in places around the United States. Most importantly, I think, because of its symbolic stature, Ellis Island. So Ellis Island, we think of it as the place that welcomed generations of newcomers to the United States. Yes, it certainly did that. It was also an immigration prison. I imagine many of the people attending this are either lawyers or future lawyers. Perhaps some of you have studied immigration law, and actually a number of the sort of canonical U.S. Supreme Court cases about due process in the immigration context involve people who were detained in Ellis Island, people like Elena, Inat Mezai. So Elena, when she was there, and she's coming from Europe because she's married a veteran of World War II, the U.S. Army, and she gets detained. She gets detained for years. She eventually loses at the Supreme Court and is eventually released because of a PR campaign, basically, that she mounts. Doesn't save her marriage, but she does get out of the Ellis Island facility after quite a long time. So that facility is operational through the early 1950s. In 1954, the administration of a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, decides, look, we don't want to be doing this anymore. We're gonna shut down this facility, specifically in Ellis Island, and a handful of other facilities on the east and on the west coast. So Eisenhower's Attorney General, a guy named Herbert Brownell, goes to a naturalization ceremony in Ebbets Field, where the Brooklyn Dodgers played, and he's presiding over this, and he says, look, we're announcing a new policy. In the past, we've detained people. Now we're not going to detain people. So they shut down these facilities. There were people still in there. New York Times says in November 1954, the last detained alien was a Norwegian seaman who overstayed his shore leave. So overstayed his shore leave, what does that mean? He had permission to come to the United States, and then his permission expired, but he was still here. So what did we do with him? Well, the federal government took him from Ellis Island, put him on a ferry into the Battery, into southern Manhattan, and said, see you later. It's unclear whether anyone saw him later or not. We have no idea what happened. He sort of disappears into the historical record at that point. But the point is, he was in the custody of immigration officials. They knew he was violating immigration law. Just let him in. So why does this happen? This is 1954. This is the same year as Operation Wetback. This is a famous initiative that targets Mexicans throughout the Southwest, places like La Placita in LA and Chicago and throughout Texas and elsewhere. So this wasn't a moment in which federal government officials all of a sudden had a radical racial reawakening. Decided that immigrants were these wonderful, nice people. This wasn't the moment in which the racism of the past all of a sudden evaporated. It was a moment in which the politics switched. Right. So this is the beginning of the Cold War. It was just after so Europe was still in tatters, was very much recovering from the war. Soviet Union was rising in power. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had actually faced off in actual military engagements in Korea in the early 50s. And you have this former general who understands very clearly the military threats to the United States that the country is facing around the world, and they view the treatment of immigrants as a part of their national security strategy. In particular, the Soviet Union was going around to all these unaligned countries saying, hey, they're treating your citizens poorly. They're locking them up in places that look like concentration camps. They were actually being called concentration camps at the time. And so that's not somebody you want to align with. Right? So eventually the Eisenhower administration took this to heart, viewing their treatment of the citizens of other countries who we were trying to woo as being a detriment to the Eisenhower administration's foreign policy goals, their national security perspectives. So I think that part is important, because it suggests that, I'm often asked, well, how do you change the hearts and minds of Trumpistas? Like, look, if you're okay with tearing a 2-year-old away from her parents' arms, I'm not going to convince you, right? So I'll leave it to artists. I'll leave it to members of the clergy to change hearts and minds. But law responds to politics, right? And the politics of the movement are what changes policies, and that's exactly what we see in the 1950s. And so while I hope that hearts and minds will continue to change, and I completely support the efforts of people who want to engage their time and energy doing that. I'm more interested in thinking about how the politics of the moment can be altered. And so we think of the 1950s. We think of it not as a moment in which there was a radically different perspective on communities of color, on immigrants than there is today. It was just a moment in which the politics demanded an alternative policy approach. And so I think that is something that we can replicate. The context is different, the time is different, the people are different, but that foundational relationship between politics and policy is not different.
Thank you for that really wonderful answer. And you managed to sum up over 140 years of history very, very nicely. And I really appreciate the extent to which, you've urged us to dream bigger, but for us to also realize that dreaming bigger sometimes requires just looking a little bit further into what we've already been, where we've already been, and just as much as it does creating an entirely new path. So I think this is a good moment here just for me to pause and remind folks about the CLE requirements. So again, if you are tuning in for CLE credits, we need you to submit each of the 3 CLE codes that I announced during the panel into your digital evaluation form, which you should have received in your confirmation email to the event. But if you haven't received that confirmation email, there's a link to it in the chat. And the first code word that I announced when we were all trickling back from lunch, in case you missed it, was abolition. So that's ABOLITION, abolition. I'm announcing the second word now. The second word is immigration. It's IMMIGRATION. Excuse me, immigration. So the 2 code words so far, abolition, immigration. You've got one more coming to you at the end of the panel if you stick around. And so Tanya, I'd like to turn to you. You've spoken already a bit about the work of getting specific counties to shut down immigration detention centers. And we've already sort of teed up shutting down immigration detention centers as one of the technical levers that we can pull to abolish ICE. And in your discussion of that work, you mentioned the financial dynamics at play. You've got counties that need jobs and they say they need the revenue, and you've got folks who work in those detention centers who are looking for jobs, and unions that have a lot at stake there. But you've also offered up on the opposite side citizens of these municipalities and counties who say, no, we don't need to generate revenue through this means. We would rather pay more taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So I would really love for you to talk with us a bit about the specific interactions you've had with both county governments and with community members. And when you engage community members, do you find that they have a sort of pre-baked position on this, or do you have to sort of walk them through it? I'm just interested in hearing a little bit more about that interplay between citizens that you're organizing with, residents of these counties that you're organizing with, and the county officials, as well as union and ICE officials.
Yeah, great question. So organizing, well, I'm from New York, I'm from Queens, and most of my organizing has been in New York. But when I helped start this coalition of groups and organizations that whose main mission is to abolish detention in New York, we quickly realized that we could not do this work without New Jersey organizers and New Jersey counties and New Jersey residents. So we decided to work together with New Jersey grassroots groups, New Jersey organizations to start this coalition called Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey. And they started to teach us about the politics and dynamics of New Jersey counties. And I have to say that I've never seen politics done that way in my life. I've lived in New Orleans. I've seen the way that politics goes down there, and New Jersey politics. I don't know if anybody's seen Boardwalk Empire, but it's still very much mafia-like. So, to say the least, and they're all Democrats, right? All of them. There's not one Republican in these counties, and so we're not here. But for them, they're not, immigrants are not really seen as human beings, in my opinion. And I only say that because the way that they maintain these facilities, it's almost like working in the Twilight Zone, because I talk to people who are detained. I talk to their families every day, several times a day in these facilities, and they tell me about the conditions. They tell me about how people spit in their food, how their toilets are not working. There's no water, there's no heat, and we just went through a storm. How the guards treat them, etc. But according to county officials and the sheriffs there, this is heaven for immigrants, right? It's heaven. And they will convince everybody. They will try their best to convince everybody, and they will do whatever it takes to protect their money. So for us, we don't care about that. I said all those things in the beginning because, just wanted to bring up what some of the arguments are, but that's not my problem. That's not my goal, is to abolish detentions and to abolish ICE. So now when working with, for example, in Bergen County, we had a protest outside, and, the sheriff there is a former NAACP chair member of Bergen County, and where the NAACP there is siding with him as a sheriff in continuing to treat people, not just immigrants in the facility, but just the general population of US citizens, the same way. People have died in these facilities because of COVID. There's been rampant COVID infections that happened in all these facilities. And also the people that work there have contracted COVID, brought COVID into these facilities. And also with the clear transfers that were happening with ICE across the country, we feel like ICE has purposely spread COVID around the detention centers. And there are, in my opinion, there are deaths that have not been reported because of COVID. So with that being said, interacting with the sheriffs and interacting with the county officials has been a complete joke, has been a complete, just nightmare of the way that they fight so hard to keep their monies. Now, going forward, we have an amazing group of organizers in all of these counties in New York that are pushing very hard. They're pushing very hard. All these elected officials, all these sheriffs, we're holding them accountable right now, every day. We call them on their cell phones at least twice a day. We show up to their houses. We make them, these people have 2 homes, so they've had to fly away to their second home because they wanted to get away from all the protesting that was happening. So that we're making their lives miserable, because people's lives in detention are miserable right now. So with that being said, when we do activities outside in the street and the residents are sort of hearing about what's happening, they're like, I didn't even know there was a detention center in this county, because all these detention centers are hidden. I've heard in Chicago, the detention facility or the facility that the city uses right in the middle of the city. But facilities in New Jersey and even New York, Rikers, they're sort of in these industrial areas where, you know, you have to walk a mile to get there if you don't have a car. So it's very much hidden. So people don't even know that these human rights violations are happening right in their backyard, and they're benefiting from those situations. So all that to say is we've garnered a lot of support from the local media, from people inside. There was a big fight between also legal service providers, NIFA, who don't want, at least in New York, didn't want facilities to close. So that was another front that we had to fight. And because of the Black Lives Matter, and I credit this to them, to that movement happening, finally, many of the NIFA providers there and attorneys said, I mean, this is not as great, it's a step in the right direction, but I'll leave my opinions to myself, but they've come out as neutral, as to not really taking a position as attorneys. So we still have more work to do on that end in terms of trying to convince attorneys to close facilities. But when we ask them, what is your vision for detention? They never have an answer. And I know this is a law school, so I just want to put it out there that there are attorneys there that can help the movement and be movement attorneys, and there are attorneys there that really can then hurt movements and really affect people's lives. Now going forward, we're putting our attention in terms of legislation. Some of the group members of the coalition are focusing on, there has been a bill introduced in New Jersey to not renew any contracts. We feel it has good support. In New York, we're working on introducing legislation as well to continue to push the cities, to continue to push the states to do what they need to do, while simultaneously on a national level, we continue to push this administration to just end detention, not just regular detention, but just abolish ICE and detention as well.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I really want to return in a second to that final point that you made about the role of lawyers in this system. That's something we've talked about, talked about through each of the panels this morning. Before I do that, a slightly smaller and maybe more local question, but Bergen County is a relative, and we're talking about North Jersey here. This is a relatively Democratic area. Both United States senators, I'm pretty sure all of the representatives from that county are Democrats. I'm not so sure about the county officials, and I know it might get weird the smaller you get.
They're Democrats.
Exactly. So I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from you. I've tried to approach this today from less of a sort of traditional Democrat-Republican divide here, because that is what we are so accustomed to hearing, but it is a bit more complicated than that. I think Bergen's a perfect example. So, we've talked about the fiscal incentives that they have and why they're clutching to those. You've also described the unique, the colorful Jersey politics. But I'm just interested in hearing from you about, it's one thing to be on Twitter and to follow abolishing ICE as a sort of as a slogan and the conversations that it invokes there, especially amongst the left and progressives. But when you're actually on the ground and you are facing Democrat officials, politicians, who are so staunchly opposing this, to what degree do you think that those types of conversations that you see happening on Twitter around abolition and immigration tend to break down or hold up?
Yeah, I think great question. I don't think the conversations around Abolition ICE online is getting to the people, those Democrats, those people in power that need to make those decisions. I really don't think so, because for them, I'd almost prefer a Republican tell me that they hate me because because I'm in this and this and that, than rather have a Democrat say, we're doing this for your own good. We're keeping the facility for. It's almost like gaslighting and a Twilight Zone, living in this space, because they say, oh, I used to be a hippie and I used to protest in the 70s, and this is not the way you do it. And I'm going to keep the facility open because it's good because immigrants like it there. Okay. And in the general public think these are Democrats, they're supposed to be on our side. But I tell them, like, no, like, unfortunately, not all of them are. They're not hearing what's happening online. they're not hearing what's happening like on the ground, unless you push them and then they get upset, right? But we're not going to stop pushing them. And some other organizations, the coalition, are actually focusing on electoral work and trying to get them out of office now. And so this, one of the hearings that we had at Hudson was the longest public hearing that ever happened in the state history. So it was about 13 and a half hours with about 125 plus, because people couldn't actually get on, testimony, giving testimony to pressure the freeholders to vote no and close the facility in Hudson. Unfortunately, they voted yes. And Senator Booker and Senator Menendez like made a huge public statement saying, you guys are wrong, you have blood on your hands, why'd you vote this way? And then all of a sudden the freeholders are like, wait a minute, I didn't know that we stood this way. So there's just, these freeholders are not in touch with what the community wants, but we have to figure out a way as like abolitionists who are calling for this to get to these individuals, right? We're trying to get to them by being in front of their houses, but what are other ways that we can get to these people?
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. So we are about 10 minutes away from beginning the Q&A portion of the discussion. I'd just like to encourage folks again, if you have any questions whatsoever, no matter how big or complicated or hard, please, please, please submit them. We'd love to hear from you. We've already got one fantastic question in the chat. I look forward to having that interaction with you all at that point. Before we head there though, I am interested in this point that Tanya raised when talking about the resistance from certain legal service providers to closing detention centers. And something that we have heard about, throughout these panels today is, what does it mean to be an abolitionist lawyer working within systems that are, fundamentally built on, the opposite premise, right? And we've heard amazing answers to, from, in the keynote address, Josie Duffy Rice saying that, just because you're working within that system doesn't diminish the value of the service that you're providing when you're helping people who need that help, to all of the other panelists we've had. But I'm interested in hearing, from our panel, both, in terms of Tanya, your work as an activist alongside lawyers, and Nadia as somebody who's been writing about the big picture, and Cesar as a professor and a lawyer. To what extent do we, how do we draw the line, I suppose, between folks who are engaged in this work in the system because, they need to, they want to provide, service the needs of the folks who are, detained within it. How do we toe the line between that and defending the system because our job, our profession, our area of the law is dependent on those systems remaining in place, if that makes sense? Cesar, I might tap you in here as the lawyer on the panel.
Oh, okay. I was just invoking my experience as a professor who's perfectly comfortable asking a question and waiting for a long time before the responses start. No, I think the first place is that you don't necessarily have to defend the system, right? As you defend individuals. First of all, lawyers do all kinds of things. Lawyers don't only provide direct representation to specific people. The lawyers become staffers for legislators. Excuse me. Lawyers become legislators. Lawyers in those two roles write the laws in the literal sense, or sometimes simply write them in the more metaphorical, I put my name on it and voted on it sense. But I think those two options are particularly salient for the students among this crowd, right? As you're thinking about next steps in your professional lives and your careers, in what way, how do you position yourself to create the vision that you and others like you imagine, and partly that's a lot of that work is the mundane work of of writing laws, of writing detailed memoranda, right, that change policies that are being applied at the ground level. And so that requires understanding currently how the current process works, but also understanding how to change that process, both the specific changes to make, but also how to do that institutionally. So that's sort of the grunt work, if you will. When it comes to those of us, those people who are actually providing direct representation, you have an ethical obligation to your clients. And that ethical obligation to your client, I think, is an appropriate one, and I think it should always supersede other considerations. It doesn't mean you can't have conversations with your clients or your colleagues, but it does mean that ultimately, those decisions that are entrusted to your client to make are the decisions that you have to be willing to advocate on behalf of, barring those circumstances where I think they cross an ethical line, a different ethical line. But I think the other piece of this that's important to keep in mind is that, bar card, in a way, there is a sort of magical quality to it. In that it allows you access to places that most other people struggle to get into, right? It allows you access to meet with your clients in those facilities, whether it's in the middle of New York, or it's in the middle of the Sonoran Desert in Eloy or Florence, Arizona. I mean, it allows you to go in there, and not only it gives you permission, but it entitles you to go in there. And one of the great attributes that the prison system that ICE runs has, because of the way it's designed, is that it is completely obscure. It is invisible, because a lot of these facilities are in the middle of nowhere. And so there's no one around to go in and come back out except the people who are working there. And so that means that lawyers are among the small numbers of people who have regular access to these prison facilities, and can then describe what's going on, not just in the narrow confines of an immigration courtroom or otherwise, in terms of advocating while advocating on behalf of a particular person, but beyond that, when engaging with the folks who do impact litigation, when engaging with the people who are interested in doing who policy work, when engaging the people who are not interested in doing the policy work but should be interested in doing that work, right? You are, in a sense, eyes and ears that can move across that barbed wire, perimeter fencing, and I think that oversight role, that your presence gives you, is something that I think it's very easy to forget that. It's very hard to turn that into a positive good, a good to share with other people who are part of this movement. But I think it's absolutely essential, if this movement is going to actually be able to flourish more broadly than it is right now.
I would echo so much that Cesar said, and just add that abolitionist thinking invites us to challenge saviorism in our movements, and be mindful of how our social positioning impacts the ways we show up and the ways that we're really not available to others. Recognizing that our liberation is tied up in each other. I think a big part of it is that your role in this fight doesn't have to begin and end at lawyer. I mean, I want a lot more activist lawyers. The movement desperately needs more activist lawyers. But sometimes your role might be like participating in direct action to interrupt deportation flights at the airport, or like offering someone safe haven in your home. Things not maybe within the traditional confines of your work, but the movement desperately needs.
That's such a good point. Thank you for that. And you know what? Actually, I'd like to stick with you, Nati, because as somebody who's worked in media, we've heard now from Tanya and from Cesar about the invisibility of this system for many Americans. And although we have detention centers, immigration courts in the middle of Manhattan or San Francisco or major cities, as well as even bigger detention centers in the middle of much less densely populated regions, we see nonetheless, between those two poles, a sort of veil of invisibility. And I personally, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion, have felt a sort of veil of invisibility when it comes to media coverage of immigration issues, and the need to abolish ICE in the last, certainly since the election, but really since the beginning of the pandemic, despite the grossly unequal consequences of the virus on those in detention and undocumented folks living throughout the country. So, as we're entering the fourth week, I believe, of the Biden administration, how do you see the media's responsibility in raising visibility of these issues, and how do they do it when it's not, when you don't have something like family separation, where there was this huge surge of media attention to the border that had never been there before, because there were all of these photos, frankly, that a lot of places could take and circulate. How do you generate that momentum, and how do you make it visible when family separation that occurs because of deportation or because of detention or family detention, et cetera, is much harder to sort of, less telegenic, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a really brilliant question, and one that a lot of immigration reporters I know are wrestling with regularly. I think there's a fine line to be walked in terms of, it feels like a lot of us immigration writers are sort of beating down walls saying, someone please care about this, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of immigration reporting that is exploitative and really sort of painful in ways that, like, you'll see dead migrant children where like a white little girl would never be sort of on the front page news, right? And that is just like a really difficult question, but I think it speaks to this really central issue. Like, finding decomposed bodies with this sort of regularity in any other part of the US would cause a widespread panic, right? But to the Border Patrol, life is cheap. Like, and those bodies are a direct result of US policy that all of us, like, we pay taxes. We are to varying degrees like complicit in this, right? So I think, of course, it's a delicate line. I don't have a perfect answer of like reporting with integrity while also like making appeals to like writing something flashy enough that people will care. And I think a big part of that is like, why do you need to see dead bodies to care, right? I mean, I would hope the knowledge that this is happening is enough. And I understand that burnout fatigue is real in a world that has just thrown us one crisis after another. Yeah, and I think, of course, journalists are always sort of wrestling with this question. And what I would say is that I would hope that readers are too, or will begin that process of just sort of interrogating, like, why do you need to see Black and brown death so visibly in order to make it like real to you when it has been real for so long?
Such a great point. Thank you for that. Well, I think with that, we've got about just shy of 13 minutes left. So I'd like to transition to the Q&A portion. Before I do that, I want to say again, for the folks who are attending for CLE credit, I've got your third and final code word for the panel. So this is your time to tune in. Again, you'll need to put this word along with the other code words for the panel into the event evaluation link in the chat. So the third and final word for this panel is justice. That's spelled Justice, justice. So we've got a few questions in the chat, and one in particular I wanted to start off with here from Michelle Ruse. I'll ask it and add maybe a little bit to it. With the consequences of climate change becoming more pronounced and disproportionately impacting the global poor, how does the panel think the US needs to prepare for a significant rise in climate refugees? And I would just add to that, with prison abolition, we need to create a world in which prisons are no longer necessary. So I'd like to hear, do you think that your answer to this climate refugee question is also in some way indicative of what kind of world we need to create in terms of an abolitionist immigration future? Is it a world in which migration isn't necessary, or is it a world in which the surveillance and racial control of those who migrate isn't necessary, et cetera? So thank you.
I'm happy to speak to that. And first, I think it's important to just really, I think that's a great question. It's important to underscore just the sheer extent of the crisis. Since 2008, around 24 million people a year are forcibly displaced due to catastrophic weather events. And by 2050, it's estimated that we'll see another around 143 million people a year displaced due to climate change, and the reasons for this deceleration are many. You know, a lot of this change sort of builds on itself over time. We're seeing farmers, you know, losing their land and forced to leave. So there's like an economic element to climate migration. And as it stands right now, climate refugees have zero legal protections. You know, the Refugee Convention makes no mention of them. There's no international agreement about who qualifies, what avenues for relief they will have, despite just like really how looming of an emergency there is. What we're seeing right now is a situation where, in terms of like emissions rates, those with the least culpability are bearing the highest cost. They're losing their homes, their livelihoods, through no fault of their own, right? Like the US is by and far a greater polluter than any of these countries that are suffering the costs. So the question is, are we going to punish the most vulnerable for having been born in a poor country instead of a rich one? For fleeing yet again, I think there's a parallel here to like a history of US war crimes, a situation that we played a major role in creating, right? I would argue that Americans have a moral imperative, given the scale of our emissions, to reject that framing and open our doors.
If I could add a couple of pieces to this. So the first thing is asylum. Don't count on asylum for this. The law of asylum is extremely narrow. It does not purport, and never has, to be the safe harbor for all people who are suffering from persecution, including death. On the contrary, it purports to do that if the persecution that you are suffering is for 5 specific reasons. And you know, the modern asylum legal regime in the US and elsewhere arises out of the Holocaust, in which it failed to protect those very people. Right? So we see that the asylum system legal regime fails on a regular basis to protect the people it purports to protect, and these are not the people it purports to protect. So the current regime desperately needs revising for the threats that are facing the people in the 21st century, rather than the threats that we failed to protect people from in the early part of the 20th century. But on top of that, so let me build on Natasha's point. That we do have a special responsibility, but we can also think of this from entirely self-interested perspective. We are not immune to the effects of climate change. I'm in Colorado. This summer we had, I think, 2 of the largest, the 2 of the 3 largest fires in the history of Colorado at the same time. They got to a point where they were 13 miles apart from one another, these 2. Just a few weeks ago, I went through Rocky Mountain National Park, which is one of the places that was burned, and you can see why people fled in the middle of the night. You can see why houses were destroyed and businesses destroyed. Parts of Louisiana no longer exist. You know, Miami Beach is regularly underwater. The sense that those of us who live in the United States, live in the place of refuge is true right now, but it hasn't always been true, and it might not necessarily always be true, right? The asylum system that was born out of World War II was born out of a situation in which Europe was killing itself. Europe was killing humanity. Now we think of Europe as being, like the US, a place of refuge, right? The tables turn, and they turn rather quickly in the span of just a few decades. So the notion that we currently occupy the safe haven, and therefore we have the power to decide who gets to live and who doesn't. Well, we certainly do from sort of a raw political perspective right now, but there's no guarantee that a generation from now, things will remain the same. There's no guarantee that for the end of my own life, things will still be the same. And so, yes, like we can think of it in the from the sense that we have a obligation to the world. But if we want to think of it from an entirely self-interested perspective, think about how we want to be treated when the tables turn. And you know, my suspicion is that at some point they will.
Fantastic point. So speaking of, sort of reframing, working it from a self-interested perspective and our sense of obligation, I want to ask a question by somebody who was unable to put it into the chat function. And the question is, in thinking about what we owe immigrants who have been subjected to brutal US foreign policy, restrictions on immigrants' ability to access public benefits come to mind. I wondered if any of you can speak to activist efforts to expand access to cash assistance, Medicaid, and SNAP, and or create alternatives to traditional welfare programs for immigrants who are restricted from accessing them.
I can try to answer this. Unfortunately, to the folks that answered the question, these past 4 years, but then I think for a number of years, decades, we've seen the slow taking away of many benefits, including voting rights for non-citizens, and that includes benefits for individuals who are non-citizens. So with that being said, unfortunately, I don't know of anybody really pushing for that, for these benefits to happen. I think folks right now are just really, at least in the immigrant rights field, are working towards really trying to get at the root of this creation of sending people to prison and to this incarceration and this system that is prison. Now, I wish people were continuing to work on this, but unfortunately, it's a little bit of a dire situation, including, with the last question about how are we thinking about climate change. Same way, it's like, I wish we could be opening up the doors and saying, hey, come on in, welcome, here's your packet, welcome to the United States. But I don't see that happening within the immigrant rights movement as far as pushing for those things, including this. I just feel like people have been preoccupied with other things. Not that this is not important. It's very vital, extremely vital for individuals to have. But yeah, so unfortunately, I can't answer that to more extent. Maybe some of the other panelists can.
I'll say that the regularization of status actually goes a long way in many respects. So if people are actually able to become permanent residents, to have a green card, and certainly to naturalize, then at least the discriminatory aspects, the legal discriminatory aspects that exclude many immigrants from accessing both means-tested federal welfare programs, but also some at the state level primarily. That sees us to be relevant, at least with regard to what might be a rather substantial number of people. And then I think the sort of the hopeful side of things is something that we have seen sort of in the last 10 years or so, which the development at the state level primarily to broaden access to, in particular, to higher education, to college programs through in-state tuition funding, funding access in particular, here in Colorado, California, elsewhere. And that's meaningful because it not only applies to people who are unauthorized, but it applies to other young people as well. And so the more that we can support people in that sense, the more that they're able to then sort of make their own decisions based on sort of where the direction that their hearts and their minds tell them is the best place to put their life energies behind, rather than simply being faced with these artificially created legal obstacles.
Excellent points. So we are just 2 minutes shy of time, and so I'd like maybe as our lightning round, I suppose, in our final 2 minutes, if we could just hear from each of you under a minute or so, what early signs from the Biden administration are encouraging and discouraging to you, and what we should look for to see how it's going.
I'll say my big fear is that Biden will be under less of a microscope when it comes to migration than Trump was. That the outrage that has been so present under Trump will be more passive. under an administration with a better PR approach. You know, ICE under Biden has already sort of drastically accelerated deportation flights to Haiti, and I know that, you know, they're framing it as they're in opposition, but I do fear that it'll sort of be put on the back burner in the face of more straightforwardly winnable fights early on. The unfortunate truth is that the Democrats have been complicit in some of the most harmful immigration policies over the years. My hope is that you will all hold this administration to task, you know, that all of us can sit with what it means to build, to live in a country built on genocide and stolen wealth, and really grapple with, you know, set aside that question of how great is America, how many people should we let in, but really, what do we owe the survivors of US policy decisions that you and I have benefited from profusely?
I'd say in the last few weeks, what's been happening. On one hand, we've seen him take some important steps, at least some indications. But unfortunately, we've also seen ICE do whatever it wants. It's still an agency that needs to be eliminated because they are not listening to what this administration is wanting to do. I think that I do have some hope that from community and from the movement here, the people on this panel, the people in the audience, that we can continue to push the administration to do what we need to do. And to continue to push other administrations as well. You know, unfortunately, we can't go back to being complicit, as Natasha said that. We've seen a number of times where there was an all Democratic a government, but they were unable to push forward and make a priority immigration. So we just want to, again, keep them at task. And the ways that you can go about doing that is by being involved in this work. You know, in particular, there's a campaign called Shut Down Burks in Pennsylvania that folks can get involved with. That's very local. That's one of the worst detention centers in America. It's right there in Pennsylvania. So I encourage folks to get involved in that fight. But also, I believe Oliver will be sending some information about how folks can get involved.
And there's, I think the shift in rhetoric is something that is actually important. I think rhetoric does matter. I think it is important to think about the way that the highest officials in the United States talk about members of our community, talk about human beings. And so I will give. I do see the shift in rhetoric that we see from the president and the vice president on down to be a welcome shift. But rhetoric only goes so far. I'm looking to see, will the administration expend some of its political capital? We'll do it early on. Will the administration exercise creatively the executive power that is granted to the president and as the head of the executive branch? So will the Justice Department revise the way that it interprets custody in terms of the mandatory detention statute in the Immigration and Nationality Act? Will it reevaluate the way that it views temporary protected status as a means of adjusting one's status to that of a permanent resident? These are powers that are within the agent, the grasp and the authority that's given to the various agencies that deal with immigration. And I'm waiting to see whether or not they'll actually use that power. Will the administration expend its political capital early on to ensure that the fight that is brewing, the fight that is developing with ICE in particular, happens, and that it comes out victorious, right? Because we've seen, as Tanya just pointed out, the ICE union in particular is notorious for opposing efforts by the Obama administration to liberalize some of their policies, in particular suing the administration over DACA. The Border Patrol Union in particular was one of the first supporters of first endorsements of candidate Donald Trump, and was a very strong supporter of him throughout the 4 years of his time in office. So will the Biden administration go head to head with them, or will it cave? And I think we don't know the answers to that yet, but if they're not continuously pressured, then I think we can expect that they will cave. And so I'm hopeful that organizers will continue to do exactly what organizers have been doing for many years, which is to make sure that they are attuned to what's happening in communities, and that they are reminding elected officials of the risk that comes with turning their backs on those communities.
Well, Thank you, panelists, so much for a really wonderful conversation. I know I learned a lot, and you gave us all a lot to think about as we head into yet another, turbulent and complicated chapter in American history. But I so appreciate you all taking the time to speak with us and the work that you do on behalf of immigrants and immigrant communities, immigrant rights. It's just invaluable. So with that, we are going to conclude this panel, and we will break for roughly 11 minutes now, I believe, until our next panel, which starts at 3 on After Prisons Abolishing the Carceral State. So thank you so much again, panelists. We really appreciate it. Wish I could give you a big round of applause in person.